Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on the fourth webinar, which is part of a series entitled Resilience and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We are very honored to have you here with us, and we are recording the session to put it up on our YouTube channel later on. We are ready to go with the fourth session, which is entitled Sendai Framework for Risk Reduction. But we still have some topics that we actually could not cover from last week. So let's start from that and go ahead. Just a reminder that, this is a dialogue. So don't wait until the end of the session. As the presenter speaks, if you have any questions, go ahead and type in your questions in the text box, unmute, ask a question. So let's make it a friendly discussion. So without further ado, let me pass on the mic to Stefan. To start the webinar. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Prabhuk, and welcome everybody. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute my microphone. And let me share the screen with you. Good. Prabhuk, could you just confirm that you can see
yes,
the presentation?
Good.
Okay, great.
It's all
thank
good,
you.
yeah.
It's all good. Okay, thank you. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world, and welcome, and great pleasure for me again to be here and talk again. Perhaps some of you are getting tired of my voice, but I hope you'll find it interesting. And as Prabhuk said, please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, comments, challenge. I do talk a lot, but it's good to try and keep it as a bit of a discourse. So what I want to run through today was just recap a couple of the key concepts, and then, as Prabhuk said, there's just one kind of topic I wanted to touch on, which won't be too long. But then I wanted to get into a sort of very practical example of using the Sendai Framework to achieve risk reduction and to achieve resilience. This is an example from the work we're doing in Bangladesh. It has an infrastructure focus, but people don't get too hung up on the infrastructure part of it. I think it's more about the principles of how we've applied the Sendai thinking in a particular context. And obviously, if it resonates and there's some lessons learned or there's some things that may prompt some of your thinking, happy to discuss that. But I think it's quite a good example of how we've actually built a program and the work we're doing around the sort of Sendai framework. I don't know if anyone has any questions from the last sessions. If anything you want to ask, please feel free to jump in and interrupt now, or we'll just jump in. I'm going to recap some of the concepts because they're important for the discussion, just to refresh, and it won't take too long. I think the first one is obviously coming back to the discussion on resilience, and just some of the key concepts around resilience, about this ability of systems, communities, or societies that are confronted or exposed to hazards or shocks and stresses. It's that ability to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover. So don't get too hung up on definitions. I think it's the concept here that's really important. How do we anticipate shocks and stresses? How do we absorb them? How do we adapt and recover from them? So those are some of the key concepts to think about. The other one was this linkage between sustainability and resilience we talked about. And the way we've sort of framed this in UNOPS in our context is this ability to withstand shocks and stresses that are coming from the context within which you're working, or the environment, not in the sort of green environment sense, but in the broader environment that you're working in. And on the other side of that is the sustainability issue. What is the impact you're having on the environment? And that's not, again, just the green environment, but the broader environment that you're working in. And these two things work together. We call it sort of two sides of the same coin. And the idea here is that you need both. I know a few years back, sustainability was the buzzword, resilience became the buzzword, but we need both. So let's not forget, it's not either or, but it's actually both of them that we need. And then the climate change issue, and why I bring this in is because I think people always view a lot of these things in silos, and we see sort of a climate change discussion happening in one space, a resilience discussion in another, and a sustainability discussion in a different place. Whereas in fact, they're all totally interlinked. And if you think about it, when we talk about the mitigation aspects of climate change, we're trying to reduce or prevent emission of greenhouse gases, activities that contribute or exacerbate the climate change or variability. And in a way that links to a sustainability discussion. So those two things are quite interlinked. When we talk about adaptation, we're trying to take steps to help communities and systems cope with the changes in climate conditions. And the changing climate conditions generally mean the shocks and stresses that we're going to face alter. Cyclones are going to get more intense, or hurricanes more intense. We're going to have longer droughts, or we're going to have more intense rainfall periods. We're going to have more flooding, sea level rise. If you think about it, those are all shocks and stresses that we're going to have to adapt to, which is very much part of the resilience discussion. And it's the impacts that are coming from the context. So for me, climate is integral to the whole resilience discussion. It's not a separate component. And so we weave all of these things together, and they all, yes, do fit quite well into the whole discussion around the Sendai Framework. I don't know if anyone has any comments on that. That's just a quick refresh of some of the key concepts I wanted to pick up on in the discussion that follows. Okay, the next slide, apologies, it's not such a great slide, but what I also just wanted to pick up on here was, the Sendai Framework is one of a number of frameworks. There's 7 of them actually. And these frameworks kind of all work together. So, we have the climate change, we have the resilience, disaster risk reduction, there's urban development, there's the humanitarian summit, then we've got the SDGs, and then financing for sustainable development. And in effect, there's a lot of cross-cutting issues and a lot of linkages between these. I know very much the focus is on the SDGs, and you will see that within the SDGs, there is a lot of text around resilience, resilient cities, resilient communities. So it does pick up on a lot of those discussions. So again, I think the trick here is not to see these things in isolation, but to try and see how they actually link together, and where we actually can find these commonalities in the different agreements or in the different frameworks. It's quite a complex landscape. I won't go into all the detail of it, but I think it's just to bear that in mind in the context that we're working in. So Sendai obviously doesn't stand alone. I think we all are well aware of that. Okay, if everybody's okay and with us, what I wanted to do was jump into a little bit of detail on how we've actually applied the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction in Bangladesh. I think perhaps people who are in the region are very familiar with Bangladesh. It's a country that's very much sitting on a delta, has numerous natural shocks and stresses that it's exposed to, very densely populated, obviously very low-lying water issues, flooding, as you can see, cyclones, potentially earthquakes. So it has a lot of shocks and stresses that it has to deal with. In working in Bangladesh, there was an initiative that was set up by FCDO, the former DFID, and SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, to look at how we can improve the resilience of communities in Bangladesh. And there was a joint program that was then conceived and put together, which was the National Resilience Program, as a partnership between the government of Bangladesh, it was UNDP, UN Women, and UNOPS. And the aim of this program was to sustain the resilience of human and economic development in Bangladesh through risk-informed, disability-inclusive, and gender-responsive disaster management in the public and private sector. Very kind of UN wordy, what does all of that mean? And how do we go about actually translating that into action on the ground and delivering on those aims and the objectives? So that's what I want to talk through, and talk specifically about the UNOPS component of this particular program, because I think that's where we can then discuss, how we use the Sendai Framework as a basis to formulate the programmatic interventions that UNOPS was planning to do. That's just a picture of the actual official launching ceremony of the program. Very interesting in that we did have government buy-in, and there was actually a contribution from the government of Bangladesh, who take the whole resilience, disaster risk reduction agenda obviously very seriously. And you will see in the text here, we talk about those sustaining the economic development. And in one of the previous, I think in one of the first or second sessions we talked about this concept of development continuity, about the loss of economic gains that happen when you're subject to shocks and stresses that exceed your coping capacity and actually cause losses. So as I said, this was a joint program with UN Women, UNDP, and UNOPS. We were specifically involved in output number 3, which was to improve capacity of the government of Bangladesh to achieve resilience through designing and constructing risk-informed and gender-responsive infrastructure systems. As I said at the outset, although this talks about infrastructure, I think let's not get hung up on the infrastructure part, and you'll see why I say that, because you can apply this thinking and these principles in different contexts in the way we talk about or think about our programmatic activities. Okay, this is also, I guess, more focused in the development space rather than in humanitarian response, but the two are linked, as we've talked about before. So whatever we do in the development space will impact on what happens in the response space. Effectively, what we're trying to do, I believe, and we'll talk more about this in a second, is that through development, we actually want to minimize the humanitarian response if we do development well. So the component we worked on was with local government engineering department in Bangladesh, who sit under the Ministry of Local Government, Rural Development and Cooperatives. And essentially LGD is responsible for all of the rural, a lot of the rural infrastructure in Bangladesh, roads, bridges, culverts, which is kind of the vital backbone for the country. The connectivity is incredibly important to allow people not only to move between Dhaka and their villages, goods and services flow, people can get to hospitals, health services, they can get to schools, farmers can get their produce to markets. So the transport infrastructure networks are incredibly important in Bangladesh to sustain the communities. And we'll kind of talk a bit more about those thinking. So in trying to achieve the objective of output 3, just some key questions to think about. So A, what does resilience mean and how do we achieve resilience? We looked at the definition about this ability to absorb, adapt and recover from shocks and stresses. We also said in a previous session that risk and resilience are linked. The more risk you have, potentially the less resilience. Resilience was also not a specific end point. Okay, it's what I call a state of being, and it constantly changes. Because it's so intricately linked to risk, risk is not static. And if we think about climate change, the climate is going to vary over a lengthy period of time. We're not quite sure what that's going to look like, but that means we're never going to be kind of completely on top of it and in a space where we can say, okay, we've done everything now, nothing more to do. That's not really going to happen. So it's an ongoing process of maintaining resilience. What do we understand by risk-informed development? And you hear this term has now crept into the language everywhere. Risk-informed development. What does that actually mean? And then lastly, which I think is quite an interesting dimension to this, is gender-responsive infrastructure systems. What does that actually mean? So when you unpack this, you can see there's quite a lot in there that we needed to think about and say, okay, what does that mean for us? I want to jump back to this slide that I'd showed previously. Sorry, I don't know if I should pause if there are any questions. I can't really see if people are putting their hands up or not, but I'm assuming, Prabhuk, you will just let me know if someone asks. Thank you. Just quickly, let's just step back to the Sendai Framework, just so that you can follow the kind of train of thought. And I've shown this previously, where the 4 priorities of the Sendai Framework are always framed around this understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance. And the focus always tends to be on this word disaster. So we did a little exercise and deleted the word disaster and came back to what I believe is the core kind of aim of the Sendai Framework. If you want to achieve resilience, is understand risk, strengthen risk governance to manage your risk, invest in risk reduction, and then enhancing your preparedness to respond to build back better. So taking those 4 kind of key concepts, we started thinking about how do we do this in Bangladesh. So first of all, the infrastructure, as I mentioned, was key to ensuring economic activity is not disrupted by shocks and stresses, to ensure the continuity of services. And I think what's quite critical here is, you'll see we're not talking about specifically a bridge or a road. Okay, we're talking about the services that's delivered. How do we ensure that the service is not disrupted? The assets deliver the service, but it's the service that's important. But in order to ensure that the services continue, the infrastructure asset needs to be resilient. But I said there's a subtle shift here to talk about the services that those assets deliver. And I'm going to just touch on some of the key concepts here around infrastructure, which might just help frame some of this discussion a little bit. So how do we achieve the resilient infrastructure assets? It was the key question. And just some examples of what we're talking about. And again, I point out these are not what we tend to think about infrastructure as the kind of huge airports, highways, big buildings. A lot of these are very, what we would call small infrastructure assets, small components, as you can see in that tall picture in the middle, a very small, simple concrete culvert that collapsed, yet that will cut off a community from a health clinic or from a school, and often result in people having to travel 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers further to get to some of these facilities. So it's not about the size of the asset, it's about the importance of it in its functioning and how it operates within that community. You can see the sort of fish bone, as they call it, brick road on the right. When that collapses in that state, it's almost impossible to travel on it with a small, what they call CNG, or people know them as tuk-tuks, or even walking becomes hazardous. So again, this is not about large-scale infrastructure. This is quite critical infrastructure that really connects communities and provides that service of connectivity. As I said earlier, so when we look at the scale of what we're dealing with, and very much at the community level, we go back to this concept that risk and resilience are directly linked. And resilience is the outcome we want to achieve through this risk-informed development, risk-informed infrastructure development. So if we use our modified, as I called it, Sendai priorities, understanding risk. Okay, so what are the major risks to the infrastructure systems in Bangladesh? And how could LGD better understand the risk that their infrastructure systems faced? How do we strengthen risk governance to manage risk? And this is one of my also pet topics. People love doing risk assessments and risk registers and documenting all the risks. But sadly, we often see the risk is not managed. And risk is not a static thing, it changes constantly. So it needs to be managed. You need to think about what are the mitigation measures? What tools, systems do we need to actually manage this risk? And that was one of the questions for LGD. How could they strengthen their risk governance and enhance their existing capacity to identify and then to manage the risks that are continually changing? As I said, climate change risk, it's a big basket with lots of things in it, but it's continually changing. So we can't just say, oh, we've done, an assessment of the increase in strength in cyclones and that's it, and forget about it, because we don't actually know what that's going to look like. So we need to update and manage it constantly. How do we invest in risk reduction? What does that actually mean? Are we spending money? Are we putting resources? Are we putting effort into it? So the question there was, what should LGD invest in to reduce risk and increase resilience? Where should they allocate their financial and human resources to reduce risk? And then the last one was the preparedness and response and build back better. So what does preparedness for effective response look like for LGD? And how could they build back better? If you think about some of those photos that you just saw, how could they build something that wouldn't collapse or wouldn't get washed away in a flood? How do we do that? So that's how we took the Sendai Framework and started unpicking these priorities to look very specifically at what LGD were doing and how best we could then design the programmatic interventions that would address some of these questions.
Stefan, maybe I could quickly interrupt you there before we move on. And I find it interesting that you mentioned that the project focused on infrastructure that complemented service delivery. And that struck me because in a country like Bangladesh, where you have literally so many bridges and so many roads, and it's how do you decide on which infrastructure to give priority on? Of course, understanding that the project or any project has a limited amount of funds. Did you follow a specific exercise to identify these key services and then identify the key infrastructure that would complement them? What was the method that you followed?
Prabhu, could I be a bit cheeky and say I'll answer that in the next discussion?
It's coming up.
It's
okay.
coming up. But it's actually a critical question, and yes, and then you'll see how it all kind of logically fits together. But that's a really important question, because I think, and I'll just add here that, as you know, in general, the need is far greater than the available resources in many countries in terms of infrastructure needs. So how do you make those decisions? How do you decide what to invest in? And that's a very key decision, a very key discussion point as well. But yes, I think the point you picked up on is it's not about the assets, it's about the service that the asset delivers. And that's quite a key concept as well. So don't think about, the road as a road. Think about what function that road performs and how do I ensure that it will continue to perform that function. Because that's really quite critical, and you'll see how that comes together in the next piece, and then we'll answer your question. So just a little quick something around infrastructure that perhaps maybe people are not really conscious of or don't actually think about, and why we use this word, an infrastructure system. And this is very key to the discussion, and you'll see it applies actually not only just to the infrastructure world, but in many other scenarios. So when we talk about infrastructure systems, there's actually three components to this. And here we talk about the institution, the knowledge, and then we talk about the assets. And I know when people hear the word infrastructure, you immediately think roads, bridges, harbors, airports, okay, but that's only 1/3 of the picture. Critical to this is what we call the capacity in the system, which is the blue big circle at the top, which encompasses the institution and the knowledge. So the institution is, okay, who is the body or the institutional person responsible for that infrastructure? Who owns it in the broadest sense? And that can be quite a complex discussion because in many governments, for example, the Ministry of Public Works will build the school, but the Ministry of Education own it and operate it. So you can have two institutions involved. And multiple layers that sort of in Bangladesh, Roads and Highways Authority deal with all the roads in the main areas. Then you've got the metropolitan areas, the Dhaka North and South Metropolitan, who deal with their roads, LGD dealing with rural roads. So it's not one uniform body that deals with transport and roads. So that in itself becomes an issue. The other part is the knowledge piece. And you'll see how this fits into particularly around the Build Back Better component. So knowledge is often who has knowledge about the assets. And this is often interpreted just as data. So Prabhu, here, coming slowly to answer your question, where is the information about those assets? Where is the information about the institution? And this is often where your things like building codes and planning regulations and all of that sit, because they need to be in there. And then we get to the physical assets, and those are the things you can see. That's actually, the asset is literally the tip of the iceberg. If I flip this diagram around, you would have the small bit at the top and then the big bubble underneath. So that's quite sort of key to understanding how these things work. When we look at this, we see that it's the institution coupled with the knowledge that does the planning, the designing. They create or construct the assets, they operate and maintain them, and then at some point in time they will eventually dispose of the assets. But all of those assets actually only have value if they deliver the services that are essential for economic activity. And I think this is quite a common theme in some countries where government will invest and build a building that looks very ostentatious and big, and people say, gosh, that's a waste of money. It's not actually doing anything. Why did we spend all this money on this? Okay. It is a problematic discussion, and sometimes you'll see in countries enormous roads are built and you go, why did they build the road there, and why did they build such a big road? Is it actually delivering an essential service? So it's quite important to understand where the information is coming from around the services that you need to deliver, and how you make choices about the relative importance of those services. So Prabhu, to answer your question, do you upgrade road A or do you upgrade road B, or do you upgrade the school in that area or a hospital in that area? And the only way you can do that is obviously if you have A, the information or the data, but then B, if you have the institutional knowledge and the capacity to use that data to make informed decisions, to start planning and designing and creating the assets. Now, in many situations, that knowledge doesn't exist, or the data doesn't exist, or the institutional capacity is weak, and the ability to process that data and make decisions is not there. The kind of structure is not there. So you find the resulting assets are neither resilient, nor are they sustainable, or they're built in the wrong place. So the tip of the iceberg often will tell you what's going on underneath. And that becomes really important for many of the resilience discussions, that it's what's going on in that capacity space that will help you decide, okay, how do we then apply Sendai? How do we talk about who's managing the risk, who's identifying the risks? Are we investing in risk reduction in the institution, or are we investing in, where are we investing in? And how are the knowledge flows happening so that we learn from things that happen and we can build back better? So there's a whole lot of interesting kind of discussion that happens in this space. So you can see that although it is infrastructure, it's actually becomes more and more about the institution and the knowledge rather than the asset itself. And in order to ensure continuity of delivery of services, we need to focus a lot of the effort in that blue section at the top, in the capacity section, rather than just looking at the asset, which is the thing that you see. So Prabhu, I hope that helps answer some of your question.
Yeah, it does. I was looking for actually maybe a more micro level detail, Stefan, to say, was there any type of a tool that was utilized? Also, when we say service delivery of services for economic activity, I assume that it could not, it should not be only economic activity, maybe for health services and to sustain life itself sometimes, because the closest clinic would be to the south, but the market could be to the north. So how would you prioritize that? I mean, and what are the exact tools? So yeah, something like that.
So in the knowledge space, and just people often get confused and think that what you're just talking about is a database. So certainly at that level, yes, this is where your GIS systems become important, so that you have the geographical and the spatial data and the information related, A, to the assets themselves, and B, to the services they're delivering. So in your example of thinking about the health service, you would want to know, where are the clinics? How do you get to the clinic in relation to roads or footpaths or public transport systems or whatever's available? But then you would also need your health service delivery model, which tells you what kind of services you're going to deliver, and your prevalence data to say, what are the kind of health indicators in the area? Are we seeing a rise in COVID, or are we seeing a rise in cholera, or are we seeing a rise in malaria, and whatever it is, and are we able to deliver the right service to reduce whatever it is we're trying to do? So without that data, it's not really possible to make those kind of informed decisions. But it becomes quite complex, because now you're bringing together potentially a public works department, a health service, because they all need to work together. And I know in some instances in Bangladesh, for example, Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief were building cyclone shelters, but LGD were not aware that they were being built, so there was actually no road to the cyclone shelters, so people couldn't easily get there because those two bits of information were not coming together in the right place. And this is the kind of thing that happens at a micro level. So the data gathering on the ground and then getting it into a system that is usable is still quite a big challenge. I mean, in trying to do some of this in other countries, you know, I've had instances where you can ask the Ministry of Education, do you actually have a map showing where all your schools are in the country? And they don't. So it's very hard to then start talking about, you know, access to schools if we don't exactly know where they are. They can sort of vaguely point to an area, but that detailed level of information doesn't exist. And you'll see in the next section, I'll jump into that, where we talk about where and what are the risks. So yes, the risk is we don't actually have the information about where the schools are. We don't actually have the information about where the clinics are. And if you do this risk assessment, and I know when often people do risk assessments, they think about hazards and shocks and stresses as, you know, cyclones, earthquake, fire, those things. But, you know, lack of knowledge is a hazard, because lack of knowledge means you're making uninformed decisions which could have serious consequences. It's a risk. If your institution has weak capacity, it's a hazard, because weak capacity means you don't have the ability to do something. What is the consequence of that? So you can see if you start really unpacking where do the risks lie, they're everywhere. At the institutional level, at the knowledge level, across your project lifecycle level, some of the risks sit within the assets themselves. So the point you raised is a good one, that we find that knowledge is a huge risk, lack of knowledge, which results in poor decisions. It results in ineffective investment because there's limited budgets. And it doesn't really then result in a resilient outcome or a sustainable outcome. So these things, yeah, it's not just at one level where this happens. So the way we approach this, we had to look at where and what are the major risks that will ultimately prevent this or reduce the delivery of the services that are essential. And not just for economic activity, you're right, there's also social services that have to be delivered as well. So trying to understand this is quite a complex process. I don't know if anyone has any comments on that, questions. Okay, still good?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Stefan, and I know we are getting here to, I mean, you know, we are using a specific example of a project linked to infrastructure, but where would, how would this diagram look on another type of a project that doesn't involve any infrastructure at all? Say, for example, a project that involves behavior change, for example, something to do with personal hygiene or health habits. How would this, in your view, how would this diagram change?
Okay, I think what would happen is we would have the institution and the knowledge bubble would still exist. And all that would happen is the assets would disappear and you would look at the delivery of the service, the health service that you're trying to deliver. And you might, though, interestingly enough, and this is sort of an interesting exercise that we did with the SDGs, when you try and look at all of the SDGs. In fact, you need infrastructure to achieve just about every single one of them. Because if you're trying to do like a hygiene program or, hand washing, somewhere along the line, you're going to need water, or you're going to need, but you don't have to focus on the asset level. You can look at, okay, what are the main risks that sit in the institutional and the knowledge level, and how do we deal with that? And in a way, we'll talk about that in a minute with LGD, because that's exactly what I was going to show in the next diagram, was this concept of business as usual, or change the business to get to the outcome. And so when we looked at this, a lot of the risks were actually not the assets themselves, but sitting in the institution and the knowledge space. It was about how they did things, about what information they had to make decisions, what research was being done, what data were they gathering, how was that data structured, were they able to access it, what capacity or knowledge sat within the people that they had, to perform their functions effectively. So that was where we actually ended up. And the assets almost became secondary. If you do the top bit well, the institutions and the knowledge, the bottom piece falls into place almost to an extent automatically. So in what you're asking, Prabhak, if you're thinking about, WASH programs or whatever programs you're looking at, it's trying to understand what are the risks in those institution and knowledge areas, and move beyond thinking, as I said, just the traditional kind of hazards, and really think about institutional risks. Do they have the people? Do they have the finance? Because that's a risk. If you don't have money, what is the consequence of that? So it's not just focused at the physical level in that sense, but it's also very much in the institution and the knowledge. So working with LGD, we realized that in the current situation, projects were done in silos. They had weak, what we called asset management. There was weak quality of construction, management and maintenance. But those risks were actually a reflection of what was going on within the organization, not really to do with the asset. But because of that, you ended up with situations where you couldn't deliver the service. So there's a kind of chain of events here that we had to follow through. And you'll see we went through a change process of actually working, and we're still working with LGD and actually changing the way they do business. It wasn't about building bigger or better bridges. It was about, how do you do it? What are you doing? How do you manage your knowledge? How do you integrate gender into your thinking? How do you manage quality within your organization? Your failure analysis. Do you actually learn from things that go wrong, which kind of links to your knowledge management? And so what you'll see is the outcome was actually strengthening the leadership. And okay, we built then a framework around what we call asset management systems to help pull all of these pieces together. That just became the kind of framework around which they could work. But as I said, it's not really about the assets. Because if they had the right leadership and the right frameworks, the output or the outcome could be achieved. And so coming back to your question, in this case, the output is the assets, but if your output is health programs, you can look at that institutional and knowledge level to understand, yes, what are the risks? Do they understand the risks they're dealing with? When we say investing in risk governance and management, are there people who are actually trained? Do they have systems to manage those risks? And you can turn each of those priorities into a practical activity that should be done? Are they investing in it? Now, in LGD, they did invest physically. They actually contributed money to the program. They invested in their people. We put people through training programs. They created internal groups and committees. They invested time to this, which is the investment in the kind of risk reduction activities. Because they realized by applying these frameworks, they could improve the functioning of the assets to deliver those services and improve the service delivery to the communities, which is make it more resilient. If you're more efficient in the way you invest money, that's more sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. So we could build it up around these frameworks. Just a bit of I won't go through this in detail, but you can actually see some of the components of what was done. And you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner, group 6, risk and review. So there was actually a whole component of this framework that was around risk specifically and strengthening the whole ability of the organization to think about risk in a different way. And then various dimensions which then addressed the people and organizational risk, the information risk, group 4, the way they delivered their assets, the decision making you'll see in group 2. As you mentioned, Prabhak, how do they decide what to invest in, which road or which bridge should we build? But it's a management decision. The building of the bridge is technically the easy bit, deciding where to build it and how big to build it and for what climatic events it should withstand and how many people are going to cross it and how many trucks are going to drive over it. That's a whole different discussion. That's the difficult bit. Then just lastly, I wanted to touch on the gender aspect because that was also part of what we had to do. And this was a really, I think, an interesting exercise. We talk about the service that the infrastructure has to deliver, and that's about the end users. Who's using it? How are they using it? And so thinking about people using it in different ways. Obviously a farmer who wants to get his goods to market will use it in a different way to a woman who wants to walk with her children to school. And if we start unpacking some of that, you can see thinking about how men, women, and boys use the infrastructure in different ways. And if people have been to Bangladesh and you drive along some of those roads, you'll see people use them for all sorts of things, from drying cattle dung, which they use for cooking fires, to drying seeds. So it's actually not just a road. It's more than a road. It's used for other things. Collecting sex disaggregated data. So if we don't know how many women and children are in a specific area, how many are going to school, how many times they access the clinic, it becomes very hard to make decisions on what kind of road should you build. So it's not about the road, it's about who uses it. And this always comes back to the sustainability and the resilience discussion. If we don't understand the risks to the users, how do we ensure that we deal with those risks? Consultation, how do we get the knowledge about these roads, how they use them? Engagement of women in the life cycle of the planning process, consulting them. And some very interesting things came out about why women wouldn't walk along the road, for example, because there's no toilet facilities. And sometimes they have to walk long distances. So how do we deal with that? Women were often the last people to leave the home to get to a cyclone shelter. And sometimes that happens at night. So is it safe for a woman to walk along the road to the cyclone shelter at night? How far is it? All that kind of information becomes quite critical to deciding, okay, so how are we going to build this road? And I keep saying it's not about the road, it's about the end users. And then the different forms of transport. Do we know, do people walk, drive, go by donkey, cart, horses? How do they use it? There was the issue, as I mentioned, about sanitation, informal transportation. So as you can see, and you can gather this kind of service information and then understand if we don't deal with this, it becomes a risk. It impacts on the sustainability and it impacts on the resilience of these assets. I'm going to stop there because I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. And we have a few minutes left. So I hope that perhaps gave you a little bit of a different perspective of how we think about resilience and infrastructure and how this kind of evolved in our thinking in the work that we did in Bangladesh. So we can open it up, Prabhuk, for discussion, questions.
Yes, I would like to invite the participants to go ahead and type your question. And if you want to unmute and ask the questions, please go ahead. But just to start things off, Stefan, maybe I can ask you how this now linked up to the Sendai framework. Which priority? Was it related to all 4 priorities? And, you know, how did it link up?
Prabhuk, it linked up to all 4 priorities. Priority 1, I'll go through them, the understanding risk. So it was understanding what are the major risks to the infrastructure in Bangladesh. Okay, and again, the risks there were, you know, a myriad of risks. Obviously, one is the sort of a physical hazard risk, but you have risks such as people can't use the road like women because it's not designed in a way that it's friendly for them to use. Okay, it can't be used by certain modes of transport. Those are all actually risks. Yes, the resilience. So if you think about what are the external shocks it has to face, one of the ones people often don't recognize or think about is the maintenance risk. If you don't do any maintenance, and you know this, people who own a house, if you never touch your house, it will eventually collapse. Okay, that's a risk. But that risk is linked to the capacity within the institution. So if the institution doesn't have the finance or the resources to do the maintenance, you're not going to achieve the outcome of service delivery that you want for your assets. The other one that may happen is you invest a lot of money, and instead of the road lasting for 20 years, it only lasts for 5 years and then it collapses. But if you don't understand all of those risks, you can't make decisions about how do we mitigate that risk. So that was a whole piece around understanding the risk to the infrastructure systems. The second part is, once we understand the risk, how do we manage it? Do the people who maintain the assets ever talk to the people who design the assets? Because if they don't tell them there's a problem with the maintenance and the way you've designed this thing, it's very difficult and costly to maintain, they will just keep doing the same thing. And then they don't understand the implications of that. So, and coupled with that are the information systems. So you need those governance systems and you need the ability to manage your risk. So that was quite a key discussion for LGD. And then the investment in risk reduction. So organizationally, are they going to upgrade all of their computer systems, install a GIS system, and invest in data gathering processes to better inform their risk making or risk decision making? Are they going to look at spending more money in capital works on strengthening roads or bridges? You know, there's quite a lot of investment decisions they have to make. But again, without the correct data, you can't do that. Do they need to invest in their people? Do they need to train people to use these systems? Do they need to educate? You know, how are they going to do that? So yes, they had to invest in risk reduction. And then preparedness for response and to build back better. So in understanding the risks they face, for example, they could say, we know that this road or this bridge will withstand a flood of X level. If it exceeds that, it potentially could get washed away. So we need to be ready to go and repair that bridge if there is a flood in this event. And we need to inform the right people, and we need to be prepared for that. But we also need to have mechanisms to do what we call failure analysis. So if something does fail, can we do the analysis so we don't repeat the mistakes? And then we can build it back better. So crafting the way LGD does its business around these elements of the Sendai Framework is what we were trying to do to improve the entire resilience of the infrastructure systems. I hope that, does that answer some of your questions?
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks a lot. Yes, it does. Let's give a few seconds for anyone in the participant list to ask their question.
Must be all very clear.
Okay.
That's fine.
Since there are no, yeah.
Sorry, Prabhat,
do you have any? Yeah. Do you have any closing remarks on this, Stefan, before we end the meeting?
No, just thank you very much. And I hope people found it informative or interesting, at least, that it may prompt some of the thinking, around the Sendai Framework to see it beyond just managing disasters. And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to get across here is to broaden the thinking about how we can use, this whole concept of reducing risk to improve resilience. And what are the different components of that? To show you an example of how this works at organizational level, and how this is being applied in perhaps a slightly different way to the way people might normally think about it. So let's hope it prompts some thinking and discussion later on. Thank you, Prabhat, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Stefan. And I would just like to announce that we have our last session on the plan for the 20th of July. I will send out the registration link together with the video recording of this session. And the last topic will be forecast-based financing. So that's going to be an interesting session. Please help us promote the webinar within your country offices, within your teams. And we'll hope to see you all on the 20th of July. Thank you very much, Stefan. Wishing you a good day, and to the rest of the team here.
Good. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Bye now.